Okay, so in just a few days, the leaders of the US and Russia are meeting in Alaska for a massive peace summit that could literally change the entire course of the war in Ukraine. But here's the thing. The real key to understanding what might happen there actually lies in a totally different story. A story about a trade war the US just started against one of its most important allies. Now you're probably thinking, how on earth are those two things connected? Well, that's the puzzle we're going to solve together. It all kicks off with this question, which, let's be honest, makes zero sense on the surface. Why in the world would the United States pick a fight, a big one, with India? I mean, India isn't some adversary, it's one of America's most vital strategic partners, especially when you think about balancing China's power in the region. It doesn't add up.
But it definitely happened. The White House just dropped an executive order that doubles tariffs on most goods coming from India. The new grand total? A punitive, staggering 50%. And let's be really clear here. This is not some small spat over trade rules. Nope. This is a full-on economic broadside against a country the U.S. absolutely needs in its corner. So what's the official line coming out of Washington? Well, they're framing it as a matter of national security. The argument basically goes like this. India is buying up massive amounts of Russian oil. That money, in turn, is a financial lifeline for the Kremlin, helping to fund its war in Ukraine. So from the White House's point of view, that spigot has to be turned off. But India's reaction wasn't to back down. It was pure defiance. Prime Minister Modi basically came out and said, "Bring it on. We won't be pushed around, and we're ready to pay whatever price is necessary." So if the only goal here was to get India to stop buying Russian oil, well, the strategy is a spectacular failure. All it's doing is pushing a key partner away. But what if this trade war was never really about India in the first place?
To crack that puzzle, we've got to shift our focus thousands of miles away to that other huge event on the horizon, the high-stakes peace summit up in Alaska.
On August 15th, President Trump and President Putin are set to sit down face to face. And their stated goal is massive, to hammer out a deal that finally brings the war in Ukraine to an end. For President Trump, this is a huge moment. It's his chance to deliver on that big campaign promise to be a peacemaker.
Now, you really got to look closely at this timeline, because this is where all the puzzle pieces start to click into place. After months of pretty quiet diplomacy, everything suddenly speeds up. On August 6th, Trump's special envoy has a big meeting with Putin. Then comes the critical date, August 8th. That was Trump's deadline for a peace deal, and it passes with no agreement. The very next day, those punishing tariffs on India are triggered. And right after that, the Alaska summit gets announced. You see that sequence? That's almost certainly not a coincidence.
So what if the trade war with India and the peace summit in Alaska aren't two separate stories at all? What if they're actually two moves in the very same high-stakes geopolitical chess game? This is the theory that's starting to make the rounds among foreign policy watchers, and it's being called the India Gambit. The big idea here is that these tariffs have almost nothing to do with actually punishing India. Instead, they're a powerful, indirect message aimed squarely at one person and one person only: Vladimir Putin.
Here's how this gambit is supposed to play out, in 3 pretty clever steps. First, you hit India, a country that's a key economic partner for Russia. Second, by hitting your own ally, you send a powerful signal to Putin. You're showing him that you are willing to take a major strategic hit just to cut off his economic lifelines. And that all leads to step 3. You walk into that summit in Alaska with a brand new, very powerful piece of leverage, showing you're not messing around. It's like a bank shot in global diplomacy.
So, okay, the U.S. might be bringing this new leverage to the negotiating table, but the fundamental problem hasn't gone anywhere. The gap between what Russia wants and what Ukraine is willing to even consider is still an absolute chasm.
And this table just lays that deadlock bare. I mean, look at Russia's demands. Ukraine has to pull out of all 4 regions Russia has claimed, become permanently neutral, and limit its military. Then you look at Ukraine's side, and it's just a hard no. No giving up sovereign territory, full stop. Like President Zelensky has said himself, any decisions made without Ukraine won't achieve a thing. There is virtually no common ground here.
So how do you even begin to bridge a gap that looks completely unbridgeable? Well, President Trump has been floating one very controversial idea, a deal that involves some swapping of territories. The specifics are still pretty fuzzy, but this idea seems to be the main pillar of his strategy for getting a deal across the finish line.
But military analysts are already sounding some major alarm bells. The Institute for the Study of War put out an analysis calling this idea a strategic Trojan horse. And here's why. This isn't just a simple trade of one piece of land for another. It would likely force Ukraine to give up its most critical defensive line, a series of fortified cities called the Fortress Belt. If they abandon that, Ukrainian forces would be left out in the open, on flat, indefensible ground, which could make a future Russian attack much, much easier.
All right, so with this gambit in play and the stakes as high as they are, how could this whole thing wrap up? Well, analysts are basically looking at three main scenarios for what could happen in Alaska.
First up, we have the long shot, the grand bargain. In this scenario, a deal actually gets made. Ukraine ends up ceding territory, Russia gets to avoid new sanctions, and President Trump walks away with a massive political win. But this is seen as really unlikely, mostly because Ukraine and its European allies would almost certainly refuse any deal that looks like it's rewarding Russia's invasion with land.
A much more plausible outcome is what's called a frozen conflict. Here, the leaders agree to a ceasefire that just freezes the battle lines right where they are. This kind of lets everyone claim a small victory. Trump can say he stopped the killing, and Putin gets to solidify his current gains. The huge problem? It doesn't solve any of the underlying issues. It just leaves a ticking time bomb right in the heart of Europe. And finally, we have what most analysts think is the most probable scenario of all, a complete stalemate. The summit just collapses. The gap is too wide to bridge. Putin denies Trump a deal, and the immediate result is escalation. More intense fighting on the ground in Ukraine, and even more punishing economic pressure coming from the West.
So no matter which one of those scenarios plays out, the outcome in Alaska is going to have consequences that ripple out far, far beyond Ukraine. This is about so much more than just one war. This is about the strategic fallout for the entire world. So why does this matter so much? Because the potential fallout is just huge. Any deal that's seen as rewarding Russia could undermine the entire post-World War II order, the idea that you can't just take territory by force. But even the tactic being used to get there, that India gambit, risks poisoning the incredibly important US-India partnership for years. That could weaken the Quad Alliance, which is America's main strategy for countering China. It all boils down to a terrible choice. Do you risk a critical, long-term alliance in Asia for the chance at a shaky, short-term deal in Europe?
And all of this leaves us with one final, really fundamental question. The entire strategy we've just walked through, from slapping tariffs on an ally to pressuring for a land swap, is built on a foundation of force and coercion. So we have to ask ourselves, can a peace that is forced on people rather than one they freely choose for themselves ever truly last? That's the ultimate question hanging over everything in Alaska.